Okay, so the big question is, how did a nation with so much promise end up in such a mess? Well, the story kicks off right after the death of their incredible leader, Joshua. The Israelites have their new homeland, everything seems set, but the real battle, it turns out, wasn't for the land, it was for their hearts.
See, the generation that saw God's power firsthand, they eventually passed away. And their kids, well, they inherited the property, but they totally forgot the one who gave it to them. Instead of driving out the remaining Canaanite people like they were commanded to, they just decided to coexist. It probably seemed like a harmless compromise at first, but wow, was it ever the beginning of the end?
This chart just lays out the core problem perfectly. On one side, you have God's command, the ideal, and on the other, you have the messy reality in Judges. And this wasn't some sudden, dramatic rebellion. No, it was a slow, creeping assimilation. The values, the lifestyle, and yeah, eventually the idol worship of their neighbors just seeped into Israelite culture until they were serving other gods in the very land God had given them.
So that one initial compromise, it kicks off this absolutely devastating pattern, a rhythm of rebellion that just defines this entire era. It's a vicious cycle that repeats itself over and over and over.
Here's how the cycle works. It starts with rebellion. The people forget God, they turn to idols. That leads to oppression, where, without God's protection, they get dominated by their enemies. Then, in their misery, they cry out for help. And God, being merciful, responds by raising up a savior, a judge, who delivers them. This brings a period of peace, but tragically, it never lasts. They relapse, and the whole cycle begins again, getting faster and more intense each time.
So let's meet some of these early heroes. And when we say judges, don't think of black robes and gavels. These are more like military or spiritual champions, raised up by God for a specific crisis. And what's fascinating is that their character really reflects the spiritual health of Israel at the time.
First up is Othniel. He's kind of the gold standard, a throwback to the good old days of Joshua. He does everything right, he unites the people, and boom, he brings 40 years of peace. This is how it was supposed to work.
But that stability doesn't last. Next we get Ehud. He's this left-handed assassin who takes out an enemy king in a pretty brutal and sneaky way. I mean, he gets the job done and Israel is saved, but you can already tell the solutions are getting a little more chaotic, a little more desperate. The cracks are starting to show.
And then we have the amazing Deborah. She's a prophetess, a leader, a total powerhouse. But her story is also a pretty sharp critique from God, because she had to step up when the male leadership was too afraid to act. Her very presence on the scene was a statement about how far the nation had already fallen.
Okay, this brings us to the book's main event, the central figure whose story is the major turning point in this downward spiral. His name is Gideon, and with him, that line between hero and, well, not a hero, gets really, really blurry.
When we first meet Gideon, he is the opposite of a hero. Seriously, he's hiding from his enemies in a wine press, totally crippled by fear. He keeps asking God for sign after sign after sign, just constantly needing proof before he'll take a single step.
He finally pulls himself together and raises an army to fight the Midianites, and it's a good-sized army too, 32,000 soldiers. Looks like a fair fight, but God has a totally different idea.
First, God tells Gideon, hey, anyone who's scared can just go home. And just like that, poof, over 2/3 of his army vanishes, leaving him with just 10,000 men.
But God's not finished. He puts them through one more test, and in the end, Gideon is left with a teeny tiny army of just 300 men. It's ridiculous, but the reason is crystal clear. When they win, and they will win, no one will be able to say, wow, our army was so strong. No, everyone will know that God and God alone saved them. And the victory is miraculous, just as God promised. But here's the tragedy. After seeing God's power firsthand, what does Gideon do? He takes the gold from the battle and makes a religious object, an ephod, that the whole nation starts to worship. The Savior himself becomes the stumbling block that trips Israel up and sends them right back into idolatry. It's just heartbreaking.
So in the final section of the book, the judges just disappear from the stage. There are no more saviors, and what we're left with are two horrifying stories that show what happens when a society completely falls apart.
The first story is about a man named Micah, who decides to create his own personal religion. He builds a shrine in his house and makes his own idols, basically privatizing and corrupting worship for his own benefit. And then it gets worse. A traveling Levite, a member of the priestly tribe, agrees to become Micah's personal priest in exchange for food and money. The religious leadership of the nation has become completely corrupt, serving for profit instead of for God.
This religious decay leads directly to moral collapse. The book recounts a shocking crime of sexual violence in the city of Gibeah that is so horrific it rivals the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. At this point, Israel is indistinguishable from the pagan nations they were supposed to drive out.
And the result of this crime? A brutal, self-destructive civil war. The tribes of Israel turn on each other in a bloody conflict that almost wipes out an entire tribe. Religious, social, and family order have all completely disintegrated. This is the bottom of the spiral.
So after all this darkness, how does the book conclude? Well, it doesn't offer a 5-step plan for recovery. Instead, it offers a single, profound diagnosis for all the chaos.
You see, when the book says there was no king in Israel, it's not just a political observation, it's a spiritual diagnosis. The issue wasn't the lack of a human monarch. The real issue was that the people had rejected God as their true king. And when a people reject God as their ultimate authority, chaos is the inevitable result.
So what are the takeaways from this dark spiral? Well, we see how small compromises can just mushroom into total chaos, and that every human savior, no matter how gifted, is ultimately flawed. Yet, even in the darkest times, we see a God who continues to work through broken people. But most of all, the relentless downward spiral is designed to create a deep longing for a better kind of leader, a true king who won't fail.
And that's the question the book of Judges leaves us with. After watching cycle after cycle of sin and temporary salvation, after seeing every hero become a stumbling block, you're forced to ask, what kind of savior, what kind of king could actually break this cycle for good? The book doesn't give the answer, but it makes you desperate to find it.